February 21, 1945. 0800 hours. Black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima's Red Beach. Private First Class Takeshi Yamada crouched in his reinforced concrete pillbox, watching through the firing slit as American Marines struggled across the beach below. Around him his squad was ready. Type 92 machine gun loaded, grenades stacked, and confidence high. They'd been preparing this position for months. 11 miles of tunnels. Hundreds of interconnected bunkers. Artillery positions hidden behind steel blast doors. The Americans would drown in their own blood trying to dig them out. Then Yamada saw something that made him laugh. A lone Marine, bent under the weight of what looked like 2 scuba tanks welded to a backpack, was crawling toward their position. The flamethrower operator. Yamada had seen these men before at Tarawa and Saipan. Slow. Vulnerable. The bright orange flame made them easy targets for snipers. Their effective range was maybe 30 yards. They had to get suicidally close to even use the damn thing. His machine gunner zeroed in on the hunchbacked figure. Easy meat. Wait for him to get closer, Yamada whispered. Let him think he has a chance. But what Yamada didn't see, what he couldn't have seen from his underground fortress, was the 8 M4A3 Sherman tanks being unloaded on the beach behind the Marine lines. These weren't standard Shermans. Their 75mm main guns looked normal enough, but inside those barrels, Navy Seabees had installed something the Japanese had never encountered before. The Mark I mechanized flamethrower. 300 gallons of napalm-thickened fuel. Firing range of 150 yards. Enough concentrated hellfire to turn reinforced concrete into a crematorium. Within 18 hours, Yamada and thousands of Japanese defenders would learn a brutal lesson. When America couldn't blast you out with artillery or burn you out with infantry flamethrowers, they'd just mount a flamethrower on a goddamn tank and roast you alive from 100 yards away. The Marines called them Zippos, after the cigarette lighter, because they worked every single time. To understand why the Sherman Zippo became the most feared weapon in the Pacific, you have to understand what came before it. You have to understand the desperate mathematics of island warfare and why, by 1945, the U.S. military was willing to try anything to save American lives. The Marines who landed on Pacific Islands carried a weapon that was as feared as it was deadly. The M2 flamethrower. 2 tanks of jellied gasoline, 1 tank of compressed nitrogen, all strapped to your back like you're some kind of fire-breathing pack mule. Total weight 70 pounds. Effective range 33 yards. Fuel duration 7 seconds of continuous fire. The weapon itself was a technological marvel in its own horrifying way. The M2 used compressed nitrogen rather than air, because nitrogen wasn't flammable. Safer, theoretically. The fuel was a mixture of diesel and gasoline that the Marines had spent months perfecting. Too much diesel and the stream barely traveled 10 feet. Too much gasoline and it burned too fast, wasting fuel. The ideal mixture created a jellied substance that clung to surfaces and burned at temperatures exceeding 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. The firing mechanism had 2 triggers. One at the front of the wand, where a cylinder held 5 phosphorus matches that would ignite for 10 seconds each. Another trigger at the back that released the pressurized fuel. A trained operator could fire in short bursts, conserving fuel. 1 second bursts. 2 seconds if the target was particularly hardened. The goal was to get the first burst to ignite, then keep pumping fuel onto the burning area. The fire itself would ignite subsequent bursts. Corporal James Womack from Mississippi knew this weapon better than most. He'd carried it through Tarawa, through Saipan, through Tinian. His platoon mates watched him approach Japanese pillboxes with a mixture of awe and horror. The man was carrying 70 pounds of highly flammable liquid and compressed gas on his back. 1 bullet in the wrong place and he'd become a human torch. But Womack was lucky. He survived. Most flamethrower operators didn't. Here's the kicker. The average lifespan of a Marine flamethrower operator in combat was 4 minutes. Not 4 hours. Not 4 days. 4 minutes. Think about that for a second. From the moment you stood up with that flamethrower on your back to the moment you either completed your mission or got shot, you had about 240 seconds to live. The Japanese knew what those backpack flamethrowers looked like. They knew what they could do. And they made killing flamethrower operators their top priority. Marine Corps correspondents on Iwo Jima reported what everyone already knew. The flamethrowers suffered particularly heavy casualties. The Japs feared and hated their fire. When they saw one of our flamethrowers advancing, they concentrated their weapons on him. Our men swore the Japs hurled their mortar shells not at our units, but at our individual flamethrowers. The problem was obvious to everyone. The bright orange flames made flamethrower operators the most visible targets on the battlefield. You might as well paint a bullseye on your back and ring a dinner bell. Japanese defenders didn't shoot at the regular infantry. They shot at the flamethrowers. Every sniper, every machine gunner, every mortar crew zeroed in on that signature black smoke and orange flame. Private First Class Charles Fisher, a flamethrower operator with the 4th Marine Division, described the experience in a letter home before he was killed on Iwo Jima. You're walking across open ground with this thing on your back, and you know every Japanese soldier on that island is looking at you. You know they're waiting for you to get close enough. And you keep walking anyway because if you don't, the men behind you are going to die trying to take that bunker with grenades and bayonets. Fisher died on February 23, 1945. He got within 20 yards of his target pillbox before a sniper's bullet found him. The flamethrower tanks on his back didn't explode, contrary to popular belief. They were actually quite sturdy. But Fisher was dead, and another Marine had to pick up that flamethrower and finish the job. The Marines needed those flamethrowers desperately. Conventional firearms were useless against Japanese bunkers. You could fire 10,000 rifle rounds at a concrete pillbox and not hurt anyone inside. Bullets couldn't reach around corners into caves. Grenades bounced off reinforced concrete or got thrown back by alert defenders. Artillery created spectacular explosions but left the defenders intact underground, protected by layers of volcanic rock and concrete. You needed fire to clear those positions. Fire that could flow like liquid, penetrate every crevice, consume oxygen, and cook men alive in their own fortifications. Fire that would force defenders to either burn to death or flee into the open where Marine riflemen could shoot them. But sending men to deliver that fire was a death sentence. The casualty rates were unsustainable. By late 1944, some Marine battalions were running out of volunteers willing to carry the M2 flamethrower. The men who did carry it were either incredibly brave or incredibly unlucky, depending on your perspective. The solution? Put the flamethrower on something that couldn't be easily killed. Something with armor. Something that could get close without being torn apart by machine gun fire. Something that could deliver 300 gallons of napalm instead of 4.5 gallons, with a firing range that put it beyond the reach of Japanese grenades and satchel charges. Enter the M4 Sherman tank. The story of the Sherman Zippo begins not in some Pentagon design office, but in a workshop at Schofield Barracks, Hawaii, where a group of Navy Seabees, construction battalion specialists, were tasked with solving an impossible problem. In August 1944, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., commanding the newly formed 10th Army, watched a demonstration at Schofield Barracks. The Chemical Warfare Service had been experimenting with various flamethrower designs, trying to find something that could be mounted on a vehicle. They tried putting flamethrowers on jeeps, which was predictably disastrous. They tried mounting them on the bow of tanks, which interfered with the machine gunner. They tried towed flamethrower trailers, which the British were using with some success. But Colonel Unmacked, heading the top-secret flamethrower group, had a different idea. What if you replaced the main gun entirely? What if the flamethrower wasn't an add-on, but the primary weapon? The demonstration showed a modified M3 Stuart light tank firing a stream of burning napalm at a mock-up bunker. The effect was immediate and spectacular. The stream of fire poured through the firing slit, filled the entire interior, and incinerated everything inside within seconds. The concrete itself glowed red-hot from the heat. Buckner turned to the assembled officers. "Gentlemen, I want 54 of these for Okinawa. Can you do it?" Colonel Unmacked looked at his Seabees. Navy construction battalion men who'd built airfields from nothing, who'd repaired battle-damaged ships at sea, who'd learned to improvise solutions to impossible problems. "Yes, sir. Give us 4 months." What followed was one of the most remarkable feats of improvised engineering in World War II. The Seabees, those magnificent bastards who could build an airfield out of jungle and coral in a week, decided to just figure it out themselves. They had no blueprints from Detroit. No factory specifications. No Pentagon approval process. Just a deadline, a mission, and the authorization to make it happen. Working sunup to sundown, they'd field-modified 24 M3 Stuart light tanks with Canadian Ronson flamethrowers for the Battle of Saipan. They'd christened the first one Hells of Fire. Subtle. The Stuarts had worked, sort of. They could deliver fire, but they were too light, too lightly armored. When you're rolling toward a Japanese position that's been hardened with a year of preparation, you need something that can take a hit. So for Iwo Jima, the Seabees upgraded. They located 8 M4A3 Sherman medium tanks and got to work combining the best features from 3 different flamethrower systems. The Canadian Ronson, the Navy Model I, and the Navy Mark I. What they created was the CBH-1, later refined into the CBH-2. Engineering man second class Joseph Kissel and machinist's mate first class A.A. Reich led the design team. These weren't engineers with PhDs from MIT. They were working men who'd learned their trades in shipyards and machine shops. But they understood metals, pressures, and fluid dynamics. They knew how to make things work. The installation of each flamethrower tank required 150 pounds of welding rod. That's thousands of individual welds, each one tested for pressure integrity. It required 1,100 electrical connections for the ignition system, the fuel pump controls, the pressure regulators. It cost $25,000 per tank in 1945 dollars. That's $360,000 in today's money. Each tank was essentially a custom build. And here was the genius of the design. The flamethrower was mounted inside the 75mm gun barrel itself. From the outside it looked exactly like a standard Sherman tank. Same turret profile. Same gun barrel silhouette. Same intimidating presence. The Japanese couldn't tell the difference until it fired. Instead of a high explosive shell, what came out was a stream of jellied napalm traveling at 100 feet per second. The flame projector could shoot 150 yards, 5 times farther than the backpack infantry version. The fuel tank, built into the sponson where ammunition racks used to be, held 300 gallons. 67 times more than the M2 infantry flamethrower. Operating at 300 psi pressure, it could lay down sustained fire for minutes, not seconds. The Marines would later describe it as heat-treating bunkers. You aimed the flame projector at the firing slit of a pillbox and just held the trigger. The stream of fire poured in like water from a fire hose. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. 30 seconds. The temperature inside the bunker would rise to over 1,000 degrees. The oxygen would be consumed. And every living thing inside would die, either from the fire itself, from carbon monoxide poisoning, or from the superheated air that seared their lungs with every breath. The Japanese had no idea what was coming. But before the Zippos could prove themselves, they had to reach their battlefield. And the battlefield they were heading to was the most fortified piece of real estate in the Pacific. Iwo Jima was an 8-square-mile piece of volcanic rock that the Japanese had spent an entire year transforming into the most fortified position in the Pacific theater. Lieutenant General Tadamaki Kuribayashi, commanding the garrison, was one of Japan's most intelligent and experienced officers. He'd spent time in the United States before the war, studying at Harvard and serving as a military attaché. He understood American capabilities, and he knew that traditional Japanese tactics, banzai charges and suicidal defense of beach positions, were suicide against American firepower. So Kuribayashi did something revolutionary. He abandoned the beaches. He pulled his troops inland and underground. He spent a year building a fortress that would maximize American casualties. The numbers were staggering. 11 miles of underground tunnel connecting everything. 1,500 rooms blasted into volcanic rock, some as deep as 3 stories underground. Command posts with reinforced concrete ceilings 5 feet thick. Bunkers with walls 3 feet thick, angled to deflect artillery shells. Artillery positions hidden behind steel blast doors that could be opened, fired, and closed before counter-battery fire could respond. Machine gun nests with interlocking fields of fire, each one covering the approach to 3 others. And 21,000 Japanese defenders who'd been given explicit orders to kill 10 Americans each before dying. Kuribayashi's plan was simple. No glorious last stands. No banzai charges that would waste Japanese lives. Just kill as many Americans as possible for as long as possible. Make them pay for every yard in blood. Hold out long enough that the American public would lose the will to invade the Japanese home islands. Above ground, the island looked like the surface of the moon. Blasted, rocky, covered in black volcanic ash that vehicles couldn't get traction on. Mount Suribachi, a dormant volcano at the southern tip, dominated the landscape. Below ground was a fortress that made the Maginot Line look like a sandcastle. Japanese troops could move from one position to another without ever exposing themselves. Bunkers that Marines cleared with grenades and flamethrowers would be reoccupied minutes later through the tunnel system. The Japanese defenders had practiced. They'd wargamed every possible American attack. They knew where the Marines would land, where they'd try to advance, where they'd be most vulnerable. And they'd prepared accordingly. American commanders expected heavy resistance. Intelligence estimated maybe 13,000 defenders, when the actual number was 21,000. They expected the island to fall in a week. What they got was the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history. When 70,000 Marines hit the beaches on February 19, 1945, they encountered what war correspondent Robert Sherrod called a nightmare in hell. For the first hour, Japanese defenders held their fire, letting the Marines gather on the beach, struggling in the volcanic ash that swallowed men up to their knees. The Marines thought maybe the preliminary bombardment had worked. Maybe the Japanese were already beaten. Then, at exactly 1,000 hours, the island exploded. Artillery from Mount Suribachi. Mortars from hidden positions across the island. Machine guns from concealed pillboxes. Anti-tank guns targeting the few Sherman tanks that had made it ashore. The Marines couldn't advance. The volcanic ash made it impossible to dig in, impossible to find cover. They just bled. For 3 days, the Marines clawed their way inland yard by bloody yard. Rifles weren't working. Machine guns weren't working. Artillery wasn't working. The Navy had pounded the island for 3 straight days before the invasion, firing over 14,000 shells from battleships and cruisers. They'd barely scratched the surface. The Marines needed the Zippos. All 8 Sherman Zippo tanks made it ashore on D-Day, February 19th. But they weren't deployed immediately. The Marines were still learning the terrain, still figuring out the Japanese defensive layout. The Zippos sat in the assembly area, their crews anxious to prove what their machines could do. On D+2, February 21st, the Zippos rolled into action for the first time. And the entire character of the battle changed. Captain Frank C. Caldwell, commanding Company F of the 26th Marines, had watched his men die for 6 hours trying to take a single Japanese pillbox. The bunker was situated perfectly, with overlapping fields of fire from 2 adjacent positions. Every time a Marine squad tried to approach, Japanese machine guns cut them down. Artillery shells bounced off the reinforced concrete. Grenades couldn't reach the firing slits. Infantry flamethrower operators were shot before they could get close enough. Caldwell was about to order another assault when he heard the distinctive rumble of diesel engines. The Sherman Zippo approached slowly, treads grinding across volcanic ash, seemingly just another tank supporting the advance. The Japanese machine gunners in the pillbox opened fire immediately. Bullets sparked off the Sherman's armor plating, completely ineffective. The tank didn't even slow down. At 60 yards from the pillbox, too far for a grenade, too far for an infantry flamethrower, the Sherman stopped. The turret traversed slightly, almost casually. The gun barrel, or what looked like a gun barrel, aimed directly at the firing slit where the Japanese machine gun barrel protruded. Caldwell, watching from his position behind a ridge, thought the tank was going to fire a high-explosive shell. He'd seen that before. Sometimes it worked if you got a shell through the firing slit. More often it just made noise. Then the Sherman fired. What came out wasn't a shell. It was a stream of liquid fire. Not the brief burst of an infantry flamethrower, but a sustained jet of napalm that poured through the firing slit like water from a fire hose. The stream didn't stop. It just kept coming. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15 seconds. Orange flame and black smoke billowing from every opening in the bunker. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Japanese defenders who'd withstood 3 days of naval bombardment, who'd survived countless artillery barrages, who'd been prepared to fight to the death, died screaming in their own bunker. The ones who tried to flee through the tunnel system carried the fire with them, igniting positions deeper in the complex. Marines advancing behind the Zippo heard the screams even through the concrete walls. Then something happened that Caldwell had never seen before. Japanese soldiers started running out of the adjacent pillboxes. Not retreating in good order. Not executing a tactical withdrawal. Running. Fleeing in blind panic, stumbling out into the open where Marine riflemen cut them down. Caldwell made a mental note. After the battle, he'd file a report that would echo through Marine Corps history. In my view, it was the flame tank more than any other supporting arm that won this battle. But Caldwell's observation revealed something even more important than the Zippo's destructive power. It revealed its psychological impact. The thing the Marines quickly realized about the Zippos was that they were more than just weapons. They were force multipliers that fundamentally changed Japanese behavior. Japanese defenders were fanatical about dying in place. This wasn't propaganda. This was real. They wouldn't surrender. They wouldn't retreat. Banzai charges, suicide attacks, fighting to the last man, that was their tactical doctrine, drilled into them by years of militaristic indoctrination. The Emperor's soldiers did not run. They did not flee. They died where they stood. But fire changed the equation. According to the 1st Marine Division history, the Zippo was the one weapon that caused the Japs to leave their caves and rock crevices and run. These defenders who'd willingly accept death from bullets, artillery, grenades, they'd run from the fire. Something about burning alive broke through the indoctrination. Something primal. something that years of military conditioning couldn't overcome. Japanese soldiers would abandon hardened positions they'd sworn to defend to the death. They'd flee into the open where Marine riflemen were waiting. Word spread fast among Marine units. If you're stuck, call for a Zippo. If there's a position you can't take, wait for the flame tank. Within hours, Marines were refusing to advance on fortified positions until a flame tank could be brought forward. The 8 Zippos were in constant demand, pooled and dispatched from refueling positions rather than assigned to specific units. They'd roll up, burn out a position, roll back to refuel, then head to the next crisis point. The Battle of Iwo Jima lasted 36 days. During that time, the 8 Sherman Zippos and the portable infantry flamethrowers consumed an average of 10,000 gallons of napalm mixture every single day. Do the math. That's 360,000 gallons total for the campaign. Enough napalm to fill an Olympic swimming pool. All of it converted into liquid fire and pumped into Japanese defensive positions across 8 square miles of volcanic rock. To put that in perspective, that's more flamethrower fuel than was used in the entire Normandy campaign. More than was used in the Battle of the Bulge. More than was used in any single operation in the European theater. The Pacific War had become a war of fire, and the Sherman Zippo was the delivery system. Over 30% of all Japanese killed on Iwo Jima weren't killed by bullets or shrapnel. They were burned alive. The Japanese defenders, to their credit, tried everything to stop the Zippos. They targeted them with anti-tank guns, the deadly 47mm Type 1 that could penetrate Sherman armor at close range. They organized suicide attacks, rushing the tanks with magnetic mines and satchel charges, knowing they'd die but hoping to disable the flame tanks before they could do more damage. They even adapted some of their defensive tactics specifically to counter the Zippos, building firing positions with multiple escape routes, spacing positions farther apart to prevent fire from spreading through tunnels. None of it mattered. The Zippos kept rolling. When one needed refueling, another took its place. When one took damage from an anti-tank gun, Navy Seabees fixed it overnight. The Marines had cracked the code. Zippos didn't just destroy bunkers, they terrified defenders into making fatal mistakes. And in warfare, forcing your enemy to abandon prepared positions is worth more than 1,000 artillery shells. But while the tanks were nearly invincible, the men carrying infantry flamethrowers were still dying at horrific rates. The story of one of those men would become the most famous individual action at Iwo Jima. Herschel Woody Williams was 5'6", weighed 130 pounds soaking wet, and came from a small farm in West Virginia. He didn't look like a warrior. He looked like someone's kid brother. But on February 23, 1945, Williams would perform one of the most remarkable acts of combat courage in Marine Corps history. Williams's unit, part of the 21st Marines, was pinned down by a complex of 7 mutually supporting pillboxes. These weren't isolated bunkers. They were interconnected, with overlapping fields of fire carefully designed so that if you attacked one, the others would cut you down. Standard tactics weren't working. Every assault had been repulsed with heavy casualties. Williams volunteered to take his M2 flamethrower forward. His squad leader looked at him like he was crazy. "Williams, you'll be dead in 30 seconds. Williams, soft-spoken and calm even under fire, just nodded. "Maybe. But if I don't try, we're all dead anyway." What followed was 4 hours of the most intense individual combat of the Pacific War. Williams, armed with the infantry M2 flamethrower, crawled toward the first pillbox. Bullets ricocheted off his flamethrower tanks, which, contrary to popular belief, were actually quite bulletproof. The metal cylinders could withstand .30 caliber rounds easily. It was Williams himself who was vulnerable. He got within 20 yards of the first pillbox. He could see a Japanese machine gun barrel protruding from the firing slit, swinging back and forth, searching for him. Williams stood up, aimed, and rolled a big ball of flame at the opening. That's how he described it later. Rolled a big ball of flame. Like he was bowling. The machine gun went silent. At the second pillbox, Williams noticed a wisp of smoke coming from a ventilation pipe that stuck up about 6 inches above ground level. The Japanese had designed these ventilation systems to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning from their own weapons fire. Smart design. But it created a vulnerability. Williams crawled up to the pipe. He could hear Japanese voices inside, maybe 10 feet below. He stuck his flamethrower nozzle into the pipe and fired straight down into the bunker. The flame followed the ventilation shaft, filled the interior, and killed everyone inside. "Got 'em all," Williams said later, with the flat delivery of a man who'd seen too much. But Williams's most terrifying moment came when Japanese soldiers with fixed bayonets came around the corner of a pillbox and charged him directly at a dead run. 4 of them, bayonets leveled, screaming. They'd either run out of ammunition or decided that death by bayonet was preferable to burning. Williams got them first. The stream of fire hit the lead soldier at 15 feet. He went down burning. The others tried to scatter. Williams got them too. He used 6 different flamethrowers that afternoon. Each M2 held 4.5 gallons, good for about 7 to 9 seconds of continuous fire. Williams would empty one, crawl back to the rally point where other Marines waited with loaded flamethrowers, grab a fresh one and head back out. 6 times. Over 4 hours of exposed combat. The Japanese tried to get Williams specifically. They could see what he was doing. They knew he was the key. But they couldn't stop him. Rifle bullets sparked off his flamethrower tanks. Machine gun bursts tore up the ground around him. Mortar rounds bracketed his position. But Williams kept moving, kept burning, kept surviving. By the end of that afternoon, all 7 pillboxes were destroyed. Williams had personally eliminated Japanese positions that had held up an entire company for 3 days. He'd killed dozens of enemy soldiers. He'd enabled the Marine advance to continue. Williams would receive the Medal of Honor from President Harry Truman. He was one of 27 Marines and Navy corpsmen to earn the Medal of Honor on Iwo Jima. Only 6 would survive to receive it in person. The others died in the action that earned them the award. 75 years later, in 2020, at age 96, Williams was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from Iwo Jima. When asked about that day, about those 4 hours that defined his life, Williams was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that captured the entire nature of the Pacific War. "I just did what needed doing. The Zippos helped. They helped a lot. But there were places the tanks couldn't reach. Caves up in the cliffs. Bunkers behind boulders. Somebody had to go there on foot. That was us. We carried fire on our backs and walked into hell. Some of us came back. Most didn't." The casualty statistics from the 4th Marine Division, which did much of the heavy fighting at Iwo Jima, tell a stark story. Among infantry flamethrower operators, the casualty rate was 92%. 92. Out of every 100 men who picked up an M2 flamethrower and went forward, only 8 came back unscathed. But the Sherman Zippos? They kept rolling. When one took damage, it was repaired and back in action within days. When one ran dry, it refueled and returned to the fight. The 8 Zippos that landed on D-Day were still in operation when the island was declared secure on March 26. By March 1945, Japanese defensive doctrine had completely collapsed. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi's final radio message to nearby Chichijima was simple: "Goodbye from Iwo." 3 days later, Kuribayashi either committed suicide or was killed in a final desperate counterattack. The records are unclear. But the fortress he'd spent a year building had fallen to American firepower, American logistics, and above all, American fire. The casualty figures from Iwo Jima tell a story that still haunts the Marine Corps. In 36 days of fighting, 6,821 Americans were killed. Marines, Navy corpsmen, and 1 Coast Guardsman. Another 19,217 were wounded. Total American casualties, 26,038 out of 70,000 who landed. That's a 37% casualty rate. For the Japanese, 18,844 were confirmed killed. Only 216 were captured, and most of those were unconscious or too badly wounded to resist. Estimated total garrison strength was between 20,000 and 21,000. The Japanese fought nearly to the last man, exactly as Kuribayashi had ordered. Iwo Jima remains the only Pacific battle where American casualties exceeded Japanese losses. It's the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history. Of the 27 Medals of Honor awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, 12 were for actions eliminating enemy positions. Bunker assaults. Pillbox destruction. Cave clearing. The kind of close-quarters combat that defined the Pacific War. But here's what the numbers don't capture. Without the Zippos, those casualty figures would have been catastrophically worse. Captain Caldwell wasn't exaggerating when he said flame tanks won the battle. Every bunker cleared by a Zippo was a bunker that Marines didn't have to assault with grenades and bayonets. Every Japanese position that fled from approaching flame tanks was one that didn't extract the maximum blood price. The success at Iwo Jima guaranteed that flame tanks would be used in the next operation. And the next operation would be the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. Okinawa. If Iwo Jima was hell, Okinawa was hell's bigger, meaner older brother. The island was 70 miles long, heavily populated, and defended by 100,000 Japanese troops, the largest garrison the Americans had yet faced. The invasion would involve 180,000 American soldiers and Marines, 1,300 ships, and would last 82 days. It would be the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War. And this time, instead of 8 flame tanks, the Americans would field 54. In November 1944, the 713th Tank Battalion was pulling routine garrison duty in Hawaii. On November 10th, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas McCrary, the battalion commander, received orders that would transform his unit into the first dedicated flamethrower tank battalion in American history. He was directed to convert all 54 of his M4 Sherman medium tanks to flamethrowers using the same shop at Schofield Barracks that had built the Iwo Jima Zippos. He had less than 4 months to complete the conversion, train his men on the new systems, and prepare for combat operations. The Seabees worked around the clock. They'd refined their design based on feedback from Iwo Jima. The new tanks would use the POACWS H1 flamethrower system, an improved version with better fuel capacity and more reliable ignition. Each conversion still required thousands of welds, hundreds of electrical connections, precise alignment of the flame projector within the gun barrel. But the Seabees had become experts. What took weeks for the first tanks now took days. By January 6, 1945, the last of the 54 tanks was complete. The 713th Tank Battalion officially became the 713th Armored Flamethrower Battalion, provisional. They were the first unit of their kind, and they were about to write one of the most remarkable combat records in armored warfare history. The battalion departed Hawaii on March 4, 1945, aboard 10 LSMs and 1 transport. 726 officers and enlisted men, 54 flamethrower tanks, and enough napalm fuel to burn down a small city. They arrived off Okinawa on April 2nd, the third day of the invasion, and began unloading on April 7th across Orange Beach and Purple Beach. 1 tank was lost immediately when it drove into a hole on the reef and was deemed unrecoverable. The battalion would begin the battle with 53 flamethrower tanks. Those 53 tanks would kill 4,788 Japanese soldiers and capture 49 over the next 82 days, while losing only 8 American tankers killed in action. That's a 598-to-1 kill ratio. It remains one of the most lopsided combat records in military history. But those numbers don't tell the real story. The real story is what happened when Army infantry and Marines realized what the flame tanks could do. The story is how a weapon system changed tactical doctrine in real time. The story is how Japanese defenders, some of the most fanatically dedicated soldiers in history, learned to fear something more than death itself. On April 19, 1945, Company B of the 713th Armored Flamethrower Battalion went into action for the first time. They were attached to the 27th Infantry Division for an assault on Kakaza Ridge, a heavily fortified position that had already repulsed multiple American attacks. The plan was simple. A platoon of flame tanks would support each assault company, working in coordination with regular gun tanks and infantry. The flame tanks would approach enemy positions, suppress any resistance with their coaxial .50 caliber machine guns, then burn out the fortifications with sustained fire. The reality was chaos. The terrain on Okinawa was even worse than Iwo Jima. Rice paddies that swallowed tanks. Stone walls that created natural defensive positions. Villages built on high ground with excellent fields of fire. And most dangerous of all, the Shuri Line, a defensive system that made the German Siegfried Line look like a picket fence. The Japanese had learned from Iwo Jima. They'd adapted their tactics specifically to counter flame tanks. They positioned anti-tank guns to cover approaches. They prepared suicide teams with satchel charges and magnetic mines. They studied how the flame tanks operated and look.